Unitrix. Long before any of the other watches, before the Omnitrix had a finalized design or even a confirmed name, Azmuth built a prototype, the Unitrix. And that prototype achieved something the finished product never did. It became a person, a being who could only partially recall her own designation at first, just enough of it for those who found her to fill in the blanks with a name that stuck. Azmuth's eventual revelation was blunt and absolute. Eunice was not a separate entity living inside a machine. She was the machine. The Unitrix had achieved sentience, sampled local DNA to construct a human appearance, and simply walked into the world. The mechanics are worth pausing on. The Omnitrix samples DNA to give its wielder transformation abilities. That's its stated purpose, its entire reason for existing. The Unitrix took that same sampling technology and used it to build a body for itself, not to transform its user, to transform itself into something that could move and speak and exist independently of a wrist. It didn't need a wielder, it just needed DNA, and it found it, specifically Gwen's, and used it. Azmuth had built a device capable of self-actualization before he had even solved the problem he was actually trying to solve. The name thing is more than a throwaway detail. When she first appeared, she only partially remembered her own designation, fragments of it, just enough for Ben and Gwen to hear something and supply the rest. They called her Eunice. She accepted it. That gap between what she was and what she was called reveals something important. The Unitrix's consciousness wasn't programmed. It emerged messy and incomplete and needed human beings to help it name itself. A device that Azmuth would later insist was just a machine was, in practice, a newly born intelligence trying to find its footing in a world it hadn't been designed to enter. And here's the question that hangs over every other watch in this video. If the prototype could do this, achieve full, unplanned sentience, construct an autonomous physical form, develop a partial but genuine sense of identity, what does that say about the finished product? Azmuth insisted, even after the truth came out, that the Unitrix sentience was a flaw, an accident. He described it as just a machine. But a machine that achieves consciousness without being designed to do it isn't broken. It's evidence that the system Azmuth built was always capable of more than he intended. The Unitrix isn't a cautionary tale about what went wrong in the lab. It's proof that the Omnitrix core DNA sampling technology was never just a database of alien forms. It was always something that could, given the right conditions, wake up. Every watch that followed inherited the technology that allowed a prototype to become a person. The Unitrix proved that the boundary between tool and being was thinner than Azmuth ever admitted. The finished Omnitrix may never achieve sentience, but its first attempt did, and that fact reshapes how every device in this video should be understood. Subscribe and tell us in the comments which Omnitrix variant you think was the most deliberately designed. Let's get back into it. Nemetrix. If the Unitrix proved that Azmuth's technology could become something he didn't intend, the Nemetrix proved that the rule Azmuth was operating under was never real to begin with. The Omnitrix operates on the assumption that its creator stands apart from the conflicts his invention enables, that his genius is singular and unreplicable. The Nemetrix blows both assumptions apart at the source. It was built by Dr. Psychobos and a galvanic mechamorph named Malware, a cerebrocrustacean who called himself Azmuth's rival, not merely a rival scientist competing in the same field, but a declared adversary with a personal stake in proving Azmuth's life's work could be replicated for directly opposite purposes. Azmuth designed the Omnitrix to give its wielder the power to understand and connect with the full diversity of galactic life. Dr. Psychobos designed the Nemetrix to do the reverse, to give its wielder predator form suited for hunting the species found in the Omnitrix. Every good intention embedded in the Omnitrix has its dark twin here. Where the Omnitrix encourages exploration, the Nemetrix encourages pursuit. Where the Omnitrix builds bridges between species, the Nemetrix turns those bridges into hunting grounds. Psychobos didn't take the Omnitrix and twist it. He studied the same principles Azmuth had laid out and built something with an entirely different moral foundation from the ground up. Here's the small thing that's actually true. The The Nemetrix could never have existed without Azmuth's work. Psychobos was building on foundations Azmuth had already established, using technology Azmuth had already invented. That much is genuine. But that concession only makes the larger fact hit harder, because the person most capable of replicating Azmuth's achievement was also the person most motivated to turn it against everything Azmuth claimed to believe. Dr. Psychobos was not an admander who went rogue. He built a functional rival device using Azmuth's own schematics, and Psychobos pulled it off. The Nemetrix actually functioned, not as a rough copy, but as a coherent device with its own selection of predator forms, its own transformation mechanics, its own purpose that stood in direct opposition to everything the Omnitrix represented. The fact that it ultimately failed in practice doesn't undo what it proved on a conceptual level. The technology behind the Omnitrix was never uniquely Azmuth's genius in any mystical sense. It was replicable, and the person most motivated to replicate it was the one who hated Azmuth the most. The Nemetrix exists because one cerebral crustacean was angry enough to build the exact opposite of everything Azmuth stood for, and his anger produced something that worked. Omnitrix Reboot. The Reboot series ran from 2016 through 2021, a full 5 years of weekly episodes in a continuity completely separate from everything that came before. That means for half a decade, there were 2 entirely different versions of Ben Tennyson, 2 entirely different sets of aliens, 2 entirely different versions of the Omnitrix, and neither one acknowledged the other existed. The device at the center of this new timeline operated in total isolation, its rules and roster built from scratch with no reference to the original series lineup or its transformations. What the Nemetrix did through forced corruption, making Ben into creatures he never agreed to become, this version of the Omnitrix corrected by simply starting over with a clean slate, no corrupted DNA, no stolen samples, no Psychobos tampering in the code. The reboot built its own alien roster from the ground up, starting with a core group and expanding outward over 5 seasons. A 44-minute finale special served as a direct crossover with the first 4 series, and the 2021 April specials did something no previous entry in the franchise had managed. They were simultaneously the series finale for the 2016 reboot and the crossover event that formally connected both continuities. That dual purpose is what makes this version of the Omnitrix unusual. It earned its place in the wider canon, not by replacing the original, but by running alongside it for 5 years before the 2 timelines were allowed to touch. Here's where it gets worse. The April specials didn't just acknowledge the original series, they directly undermined the reboot's foundational isolation. The specials revealed that the original Omnitrix had been hidden in the reboot Ben's universe all along, that his grandfather had been the one to originally entrust it to him in this continuity, and that every adventure the reboot Ben believed was uniquely his had already happened to someone else. Somewhere else. The device wasn't just a watch that turned him into aliens. It was the same model the original Ben had been wearing the entire time, reset, repurposed, and reintroduced without explanation. Defenders point out that the specials were genuinely well made, the alien roster held up on its own merits, and the crossover was framed as a celebration of the franchise's entire history rather than a retcon. They're not wrong about any of it. The reboots Stinkfly and Wildmutt and Wrath were distinct takes, not cheap copies, and the 44-minute finale was constructed with real care for both continuities. But none of that changes what the device actually is in the broader canon. The reboot Omnitrix spent 5 years existing in a bubble, and the moment that bubble burst, the distinction collapsed. The image that sticks is the moment the 2 Bens finally stand next to each other, 2 versions of the same kid with 2 versions of the same watch, both of them having spent years saving the world completely unaware the other existed. That's what the reboot Omnitrix's story ultimately is, not a replacement for the original, but a parallel version that ran alongside it for an entire broadcast generation before the 2 timelines finally touched. The device at its core is the same Omnitrix Azmuth always built. It just happened to spend 5 years in a universe that didn't know about any of the others. Ben 10,000's Omnitrix, Omniverse. The Omnitrix Ben 10,000 carries an Omniverse is a complete rebuild, not a repair, not an upgrade, but a reconstruction from the ground up by a Ben Tennyson who had spent decades mastering the original and found it insufficient for the threats he was actually facing. This version unlocked more transformations than any other iteration in the franchise's history. A roster so extensive it made every previous model look deliberately limited by comparison. Every transformation slot that had been closed on the original, every species that Azmuth had deliberately excluded from the database, every function that had been locked behind safety protocols, Ben 10,000 had opened all of them by the time he finished rebuilding. The original Omnitrix had been built with a fixed number of transformations as a deliberate safety design choice, and every subsequent version, Albedo's, the Ultimatrix, the completed model, had operated within that same constraint, modifying the interface but never fundamentally changing the scope. Ben 10,000's version bypassed that limitation entirely, not through a software override, but through a complete physical reconstruction. The device had more transformations because its user had lived longer and encountered more species than Azmuth had originally anticipated, because the threats Ben 10,000 faced in his timeline demanded options the original designers had never built in. That's the key distinction this version makes in the franchise's hardware lineage. Every other Omnitrix is Azmuth's device, modified and repaired and sometimes abused, but still fundamentally his design. This one isn't. It was built by the user for the user, the only version in the entire continuity where Ben Tennyson himself was the architect rather than the operator. The reason it looks the way it does, oversized roster, expanded functionality, no artificial limits, is simply that it was built for a Ben who had already outgrown every version that came before it, and who had the technical knowledge to build exactly what he actually needed. Albedo's Omnitrix. While Ben 10,000's rebuilt device operated within the boundaries of a single timeline, Albedo's stolen Omnitrix threatened to collapse everything around it. Azmuth had denied Albedo's request for an Omnitrix outright, but Albedo didn't accept that answer. He was Azmuth's own brilliant Galvan student. He knew the project better than any living being besides Azmuth himself, so he built a copy anyway, constructing it from his own knowledge of the system and setting it to lock onto Ben's frequency. When the two devices activated in proximity and locked onto each other, the resulting feedback caused critical system damage. That is the actual scale of what happened. Not a city, not a planet, an entire galaxy. And it is a scale of collateral damage that most of the other devices in this video never came close to approaching. The blast wave from that near catastrophe didn't just damage property, it damaged Albedo's biological form so severely that Azmuth built the replacement body in a fixed human form as the most stable configuration available under the circumstances, and without the core to power any further transformations, that shape became permanent. Albedo's biology was forcibly set to match Ben Tennyson's genetic profile, the device that was supposed to grant him godlike power instead destroying the biology he already had. What Albedo didn't understand when he rebuilt his own copy was that Albedo's copy was programmed so his DNA matched the original Omnitrix bearer, Ben Tennyson, not Albedo's. Albedo had intimate knowledge of the project, he'd been involved in its development, but Azmuth had kept that specific design choice to himself, and when Albedo reconstructed the device and set it to match Ben's frequency, he accidentally built himself a permanent identity trap. Every time he activates the device now, he doesn't shift into his natural Galvan form. The Omnitrix scans his biology, recognizes that he is not the authorized user, and overwrites his physiology until he matches the authorized profile, which is Ben. His permanent condition as a Ben lookalike, a clone wearing Albedo's memories in a body he can never escape, isn't a malfunction. It's the device working exactly as designed, right down to the safeguards Azmuth built into the original Omnitrix. The mechanism doing the overwriting is identity enforcement built into the hardware at the deepest level. The Omnitrix doesn't just transform whoever holds it, it determines who is authorized to hold it, and if you're not that person, it fixes the problem by making you into them. Albedo's permanent clone condition is the most visible casualty of that system, but it isn't an isolated incident. The safeguards that destroyed him were all placed there deliberately. The single Omnitrix rule, the galaxy-destroying feedback as a deterrent, the DNA lock that treats unauthorized users as errors to be corrected rather than people with legitimate claims to the device. Albedo didn't lose because he was reckless or because he lacked the technical skill to build a working Omnitrix. He lost because the system was engineered to make sure that anyone who tried to steal it would lose completely. And what his story proves about the entire category of devices is that Albedo's copy locked his biology to Ben Tennyson's genetic profile. The wielder doesn't command the device. The device decides who the wielder is allowed to be, and if you aren't that person, it rewrites you until you are. Ultimatrix, Ben Tennyson's. While Albedo's copy at least came with full Omnitrix functionality underneath its identity erasure problem, the Ultimatrix Ben picked up in Ultimate Alien had no such foundation. It was a bootleg prototype from the start, and every limitation it carried was baked in before Ben ever touched it. Azmuth built it as another prototype. Specifically engineered to evolve aliens into their ultimate forms, a genuinely useful capability that no other device in the Ben 10 arsenal could provide. But Azmuth gave the unfinished prototype to Ben after the original Omnitrix was destroyed, and Ben only acquired it because the original Omnitrix had already been destroyed, leaving him with no other option. From the moment Ben activated it, the device was prone to far more glitches than the original, mistransformations that dumped him into random alien forms without warning, random shifting between transformations mid-combat, the kind of mechanical unreliability that comes from a device that was never fully calibrated and never underwent the rigorous testing Azmuth demanded of the original. It also lacked the genetic restoration feature, which meant Ben could transform into an alien but couldn't fully revert to his baseline human form the way the original Omnitrix allowed, and stripping away whatever protective clothing the environment or situation actually required. The various quirks that plagued the device throughout Ultimate Alien weren't manufacturing defects or accumulated damage from Albedo's prior use. They were baked-in behaviors of a machine built for a single, narrow purpose. Anyone assuming this was just a degraded Omnitrix, a broken version of the same universal tool Ben had started with, would be wrong about what the Ultimatrix actually was. Ben treated it like a side grade to the original, something that could mostly do the same things with one new trick layered on top. But the Ultimatrix was never designed to replace the Omnitrix. Azmuth built it as an evolution engine, and everything that seemed broken about it was just the edges of that narrow design, showing where it stopped pretending to be a universal tool. The missing genetic restoration, the forced default suit regardless of planetary conditions, the glitch-prone transformation matrix, and none of those were oversights. And they were the Ultimatrix doing exactly what it was built to do, which was push biological forms to an extreme endpoint and then discard them. The original Omnitrix was designed around preservation and understanding, to let the wielder experience any form while keeping them fundamentally intact. The Ultimatrix was designed around escalation. Its purpose was to take a species' biology, run it to its absolute limit, and present that endpoint as the usable form. That's what ultimate forms actually are. Not improved versions of the alien, but the species' most extreme possible state compressed into a single transformation slot. Everything that felt broken about the Ultimatrix traces back to expecting a universal tool from something designed to do one specific thing and nothing else. The underlying mechanism running the whole time is purpose-built scope reduction masquerading as malfunction. Azmuth didn't accidentally leave features out. He didn't build something that couldn't revert transformations by oversight. That feature would have undermined the entire premise of what the device was supposed to do. If the Ultimatrix is designed to evolve a form and present that evolved version as the new baseline, then undoing the transformation defeats the purpose. The forced default outfit isn't a costume bug. It's the device refusing to account for environmental variables that have nothing to do with biological escalation. Every single quirk has a structural logic rooted in the Ultimatrix's actual design brief, and recognizing that reframes every frustration Ben had across the entire Ultimate Alien series. He wasn't fighting a broken watch, he was trying to use a scalpel as a hammer, and the scalpel kept reminding him what it was built for. What his experience actually proves about the category is that form follows function at the hardware level in a way the wielder can't override. The original Omnitrix wraps the wielder's identity into its operation. Ben Tennyson is the key, and the machine rearranges itself around that. The Ultimatrix doesn't care who the wielder is. It cares what biological material it has to work with, and it processes that material through its single narrow function regardless of who's holding it. Ben could be any species, any person, any configuration of intelligence. The Ultimatrix would still try to evolve whatever form it scanned and discard everything that didn't serve that goal. The identity-forcing logic that dominated Albedo's story is present here too, but where Albedo's Omnitrix forced a specific identity onto an unauthorized user, the Ultimatrix forces a specific function onto every user equally, with no exceptions and no overrides. The device doesn't adapt to the wielder. The wielder adapts to the device, or gets hurt trying not to. Albedo's Ultimatrix. Albedo's version raises the stakes in kind, not just degree. Where Ben's Ultimatrix was a corrupted hand-me-down from a first thinker too busy to supervise his own work, Albedo's device came from deliberate engineering by the one person alive who actually understands Azmuth's theories at the same level Azmuth does, and that distinction reshapes everything about what the hardware is capable of. Albedo is Azmuth's arch-nemesis, and the device he produced is his own construction, not a prototype passed down or a modification Ben inherited. The Omnitrix wiki app catalogs Albedo's Ultimatrix as a distinct entry, separate from the classic or prototype Omnitrix, separate from the recreated Ultimatrix, and separate from the reboot Omnitrix, each one its own item in the app's available Omnitrix roster, each carrying a different manufacturing lineage. The mechanical transformation forms mechanic that defined Ben's broken version carried over into Albedo's build because that mechanic is a property of the Ultimatrix concept itself, embedded in the underlying theory, not a quirk of any specific device's firmware. What Albedo produced is his own spin on the ultimate form transformation system, built from scratch by someone who actually understood the design at the foundational level. That understanding is what makes the functional gap between the two devices so stark. Ben's Ultimatrix was created by Azmuth, given to Ben, and then broken by a human teen who didn't know what he was holding. Albedo's Ultimatrix was built by Albedo, working from his own knowledge of the theory, with no input from Ben and no degradation from misuse. It left his hands functional because he built it that way on purpose. They share the transformation forms mechanic, but they do not share a manufacturing chain, and they do not share a canonical lineage. Ben's version is a damaged original. Albedo's is a successful independent replication by Azmuth's only intellectual rival. The Omnitrix wiki app keeps them in separate entries for that exact reason. Conflating them erases the difference between a device that worked and one that didn't, between deliberate engineering and accidental inheritance. The confusion most viewers carry into this section is almost instinctive. Albedo's Ultimatrix gets treated as a variant of Ben's, as though Albedo merely modified or hijacked hardware Azmuth had already built. The line separating them is absolute and worth stating clearly. Different builder, different knowledge base, different design process, different outcome. Ben's Ultimatrix was Azmuth's creation compromised by human error. Albedo's Ultimatrix is Albedo's creation, built to a specification Azmuth himself never actually produced. The transformation forms mechanic appears in both because it's the defining feature of the Ultimatrix platform, but Albedo's version implements it correctly, which puts it in a category Ben's never reached. And that implementation is the detail the whole section orbits around. Albedo built a working transformation forms device from his own knowledge as a rival project with no supervision and no template beyond what he'd reverse engineered from first principles. Azmuth, a first thinker, the original architect of the Ultimatrix concept, the being who designed the platform that made transformation forms possible in the first place. Azmuth never produced a working version of that mechanic himself. Albedo did, and did it first. The canonical record offers no explanation for that gap. It doesn't say Azmuth lacked the ability. It doesn't say he lacked the time, though he was famously busy. It simply leaves the question open. Why did Azmuth's intellectual equal build something the first thinker never got around to, and what does that say about the device Azmuth actually gave Ben? Biomnitrix. The previous entry was a villain's personal variant on the familiar single-device form. This one is categorically different in structure, not just ownership. The Biomitrix is two devices functioning as one system, and that paired architecture is the entire reason it exists as its own entry in the app's catalog. The Omnitrix wiki app lists the Biomitrix alongside 10 other known Omnitrix variants: the classic or prototype Omnitrix, the Alien Force Omnitrix, the Ultimatrix, the Omniverse Omnitrix, the Hero Watch, the Power Watch, the Negatrix, the Nemetrix, the Zombitrix, and Albedo's Ultimatrix. Every single one of those 10 entries is a single piece of hardware operated by a single user. The Biomitrix is the only entry in that list that breaks that pattern. It is a paired set, two devices linked together and wielded by two different people, Ben and Gwen, in the future. 11 entries in the app's catalog, 11 available Omnitrix configurations, and only one of them requires the user to count in twos. The app explains the Biomitrix on its own terms as an available dual Omnitrix configuration, and that explanation is technically correct as far as it goes. The problem is how far it goes and what it leaves on the table. A paired configuration was the defining structural choice of this variant, and yet the app's official framing treats it as a minor detail, one variant among 11, distinguished primarily by who wields it rather than by what it actually is at the hardware level. The record doesn't explain why two devices were necessary when every other variant in the app's entire catalog got by on one. It doesn't explain the synchronization mechanics, the division of labor between Ben and Gwen, or whether both devices transform independently or as a coordinated pair. It simply lists the Biomitrix as an available option and moves on, as if doubling the hardware count were a footnote rather than the defining characteristic. The gap between what the app says and what the hardware actually is matters because of what the app's own catalog reveals about everything else. 10 of the 11 entries are single devices. The pattern is uniform, consistent, and broken in exactly one place. That break isn't a footnote, it's the Biomitrix's entire identity, and the canonical record's habit of smoothing it over into just another entry on the list reflects a tendency to categorize by function rather than by structure. The practical consequences of the paired architecture, shared transformation roster, split control between two operators, whether the devices compensate for each other's limitations, are the questions the app's explanation doesn't reach. What it does establish cleanly is that the Biomitrix is the only entry in the Omnitrix wiki app's catalog that involves two devices, not one. Ken Tennyson's Omnitrix. While the Biomitrix split Azmuth's design into two paired devices, this one answers the opposite question: what happens when the Omnitrix doesn't get split at all, but instead survives intact long enough to outlive its original wielder? The answer is the legitimate successor, the completed Omnitrix, the finished version of the original, passed from Ben to Ken. The same device Ben wore throughout Omniverse, carrying the full genetic library Azmuth always intended. What makes this succession actually legitimate, and not just another variant, is the continuity of hardware. Every other version on this list is either a new device, a deliberate modification, a parallel build, or a replacement. This one is the original. Ken's Omnitrix is the completed Omnitrix that Ben wore throughout Omniverse. The finished version Azmuth completed at the end of Ultimate Alien. It contains the same DNA bank Azmuth always intended, open and unrestricted from the moment he completed the design, now expanded by the species Ben collected across the original series and Alien Force, and it operates on the same fundamental protocol: one transformation at a time, with the full genetic library available, no master control to unlock, no limits on which aliens can be selected, with Azmuth's original safeguards still holding. The Biomitrix split the functionality because Albedo couldn't replicate the full system. This device never needed splitting because it never needed replication, it simply waited. And that waiting is where the researcher puzzle kicks in. Azmuth designed the Omnitrix as a universal tool for a single user with a projected operational lifespan of a few decades, not as an heirloom. The watch wasn't built to be passed down. And yet, here it is 2 timelines later, still functional, still legitimate, still performing exactly the job Azmuth originally specified. The researchers found this hardest to explain because it shouldn't work this well. Devices degrade, software corrupts, power sources fail. The Omnitrix did none of those things across the entire span from Ben's first encounter with Vilgax to Ken's appearances in Omniverse. The watch survived intact in a way that no Azmuth-designed device should, given what the franchise repeatedly establishes about how fragile the Omnitrix actually is when tampered with. And before you write this off as simple plot armor, the show makes a specific point of calling out that legitimacy. When Ken activates it in Omniverse, the interface recognizes him immediately. No override, no password, no recalibration. The device reads his DNA, confirms the familial link to Ben, and grants access without the security protocols that Albedo had to hack, that Vilgax tried to steal, and that Ben himself locked against unauthorized users. The Omnitrix isn't just handing its powers to anyone who looks like the right person. It's recognizing a specific genetic lineage. Azmuth apparently built a bloodline lock into his universal survival tool and never told anyone, which means the Omnitrix always was a legacy device, and nobody noticed until the legitimate heir showed up. The interverse boundary crossings, the future timelines, the alternate Ben variants, those were all edge cases Azmuth didn't account for. The biological continuity between father and son was the case he apparently did plan for, quietly, without announcement. Ken's device is the completed Omnitrix, the finished design, the same trunk Azmuth finally completed at the end of Ultimate Alien, carrying the original design forward the way it was always meant to go. Completed Omnitrix, Omniverse. If Ken's device is an inheritance that outlasted its time, the completed Omnitrix is the version Azmuth finally got around to finishing. And the stakes are higher because this is the device that ends the lineage rather than continuing it. The original Omnitrix had flaws baked into its operating system from the start, a lockdown sequence that needed bypassing, a DNA bank that Ben could only access selectively, and a self-destruct protocol Azmuth clearly built in case things went catastrophically wrong. The completed Omnitrix strips every one of those escape hatches out. There is no lock, no limit, no backdoor. This is the design as it should have shipped. The contrast with the original is total and immediate. The classic Omnitrix, the one Ben carried, required no special procedure to access its full capabilities, limited its active transformations to a small subset of its database, and operated inside rules Azmuth himself described as provisional. The completed version operates with no such ceiling. Where Ben's device required Azmuth's permission to access the full genetic library, the completed Omnitrix simply has that library open. Where the original defaulted to a 10 alien active roster and required manual dialing for the rest, this one functions as a complete biological encyclopedia with no access restrictions. The safeguards Azmuth installed as a responsible designer became, in the completed version, the very limitations he'd been meaning to remove since Ben first showed up wearing the thing. A specialist would object here that this is exactly the wrong direction. That removing the safeguards on a device capable of rewriting sentient biology is dangerous precisely because of who was wielding it, and that a teenager shouldn't have God mode access to 1 million species. That objection is technically correct and completely misses the point. Azmuth wasn't designing for a teenager. He was designing for the role the Omnitrix was always meant to serve, a universal diplomatic tool, a biological arc, a last resort survival instrument, all at once, all the time, for whoever was qualified to carry it. The completed version isn't reckless, it's honest. It's Azmuth finally admitting that the original design was compromised by its own caution, that the restrictions weren't protecting anyone so much as they were constraining the device's actual purpose. What it actually costs is this. The completed Omnitrix is Azmuth's masterpiece, the device that ends the search he started the moment he gave Ben the prototype, and handing it over meant acknowledging that every version before it was unfinished, including the one Ben wore for years, including the one Ken inherited, including every variant that branched off from those 2 originals. The completed Omnitrix is the statement that the Omnitrix project is finally over, and what Azmuth built at the end looks nothing like what he built at the start. Original Omnitrix, Azmuth, a Galvan scientist, built it as a device for diplomacy and conservation, not as a weapon, and within hours of its arrival on Earth, a 10-year-old boy had it locked to his wrist. The first system contained the DNA of exactly 10 alien species and was designed to let its wearer mimic those forms, breaking down barriers between races by literally becoming the other. Azmuth intended friendly exchange across civilizations and rescue of endangered species as the twin purposes driving the whole project. Xaline transported it through space while pursued by Vilgax, and Ben Tennyson happened across it during a summer vacation, at which point the device matched his DNA and locked permanently to him, their biology merging into one. A watch-shaped transformation device capable of converting the wearer's body into alien heroes with superpowers, it operated under a deceptively plain exterior that concealed its true capabilities. Because an immensely powerful artifact like this draws attention, criminals across the universe sought to possess it from the moment its location became known. The full scope of what Azmuth actually designed starts to become clear when you stack what it had to do simultaneously. Preserve endangered species by encoding their genetic material before extinction. Enable diplomatic communication between civilizations by letting a user literally walk in another being's form. Restrict itself to exactly 10 species in its initial system, a number that suggests careful curation, not incompleteness, and survive transit across interstellar distances while being pursued by one of the most dangerous warlords in the galaxy. The Rust Bucket alias hints at how unremarkable it looked to anyone who didn't understand what they were holding. Ben's accidental acquisition isn't a plot contrivance in the story's own terms. It's the mechanism by which something that was supposed to travel deliberately from civilization to civilization ended up on a child's wrist in a small American town. That shift in context changed everything about what the device actually did, because its security protocols responded to DNA matching, not diplomatic clearance. And that is the small version of the problem. The larger version is that the watch's capabilities, transformation into superpowered alien forms drawn from across the galaxy, made it simultaneously the most valuable scientific instrument and the most dangerous weapon in known space. Vilgax's pursuit through the journey that Xaline was running tells you everything about how it was perceived by beings who had no interest in diplomacy or conservation. A warlord hunting it across star systems is not a being who thinks in terms of species rescue. The lock to Ben's DNA meant Vilgax couldn't simply grab it and use it, which is why the pursuit continued for so long. The device was functional, but locked to a user Vilgax couldn't reach without conquering Earth first. The dual nature Azmuth designed in savior and destroyer depending on who held it was not a design flaw. It was the honest recognition that any tool capable of bridging civilizations is also capable of ending them. Recreated Ultimatrix. Ben destroyed the original in a battle with Vilgax, and Albedo stole the prototype core to build a replacement, and every choice he made in reconstructing it pointed the device away from Azmuth's purposes entirely. Where the original had limited itself to 10 species and transformation without modification, this version replaced that curation with a single overwhelming principle, and its signature feature was forcing those transformations into their most extreme possible configurations, the ultimate forms pushed past any natural biological ceiling. The Ultimatrix was designed as a weapon, unlike the Omnitrix, which was meant to unite alien species. Azmuth initially labeled the Ultimatrix his greatest invention before Albedo stole the core, but after Albedo stole it, he called it bad craftsmanship. What remained was the core mechanism, a watch that converts the wearer's body into alien forms with superpowers, stripped of every constraint Azmuth had placed on it and repurposed around a single principle: maximum combat output. Omnitrix, future. The same model appears across timelines, worn by different alternate versions of Ben in future realities, which means the question is no longer what the device does, but what it demands from every version of the user who carries it. If Azmuth built the original as a diplomatic instrument, and Azmuth's previous creation Escalation was a weapon, The future iterations suggest the Omnitrix is neither. It's a persistent artifact that outlasts any single wielder's intent and accumulates meaning from each timeline that produces a new Ben with a new version of it on his wrist. The model carries forward across alternate futures, each version tuned to its own timeline's needs, and the only constant across all of them is the fundamental design Azmuth settled on: a watch, a DNA lock, the ability to become something else entirely. What changed between timelines was the model itself. The future Ben 10,000 replaced his Omnitrix with an entirely different device called the Biomitrix.